So, welcome everybody. This is the last event in the series that was started. For those of you who just stumbled into this one, this was a little series about kind of growing a sphere of influence around first individual, then group, and then organizations, and now the bigger context in the context of sociocracy. And the occasion was of these events that this is Sociocracy for All's 10th birthday. And Jerry and I are still in that founder position. I mean, why still? We will forever be. And still, um, we're looking at handing off some of the knowledge and some of the experience and the stories that we got because of being part of this movement, right? Because so many people were contributing to it. So we kind of, it feels to me like I got so much out of that big pot, and this is our way of giving back. And also, Jerry and I have been in very close contact for many years. And because of that, a lot of the stuff kind of had a short way to travel. A lot of the shared experiences and reflections and so on, we were able to share pretty quickly and learn really fast. And this is an attempt to do a little bit of a recap of stuff we've talked about in the past to bring people in. That's, I think, the summary. Is there anything else you want to say, Jerry?
Maybe it's not also, perhaps not just a recap, because the way we would work is we didn't really like, okay, let's sit down and have a deep conversation for an hour about something. That's not usually the way we worked. It was like, I'd be in my office space and Ted would come up. I have an idea. Do you have a moment? Yeah. And it would be a moment, and we'd chat a little bit, and then we'd go on. And so it was a lot of short bits of dialogue, I guess. So I'm guessing that's part of what we'll wind up doing in this session too, together.
Yep. And as a reminder and kind of as a setting of the intention, I also wanted to paste the description of today's kind of the teaser into the chat. And shall that be our grounding maybe? And then we'll begin. How does sociocracy relate to other systems like nonviolent communication, the Ostrom principles, accommoding, theory U, permaculture? What kinds of environments does sociocracy thrive in, and in which environments does sociocracy reach its limits? In this event, we stretch into the biggest vision we can stretch into, a world where systems like sociocracy are common sense. And a lot of that we want to do together. But first, let's begin. And I think I'm going to start, Jerry. One
Yes.
of the things um, that we wanted to kind of get out of the way first, but it's also an entryway, is that it is very, very clear and has always been very, very clear to us that sociocracy is just a governance system. That's all it is. That's all it promises. That's all it does, in a way. And I'm saying that because sometimes people think, oh, there's a new system. It will solve all my issues. This Organizations that are looking to do all kinds of things, and they think, oh, great, if we have sociocracy, all of that will magically somehow be no problem anymore. And that's, I mean, besides the fact that governance is still involving a lot of judgment calls and figuring things out, it doesn't affect everything because there are then other systems that sociocracy needs to play with. And that's the whole point of the session here. For example, there are things about mindset, about communication, about organizational well-being in general, about maybe structures where sociocracy isn't the right place. For example, if you have more like marketplace situations. And for some of the ones that I've mentioned, there's nonviolent communication, and there's other frameworks like that, like clean language and imago and whatnot. Organizational well-being is something I would put into that box as Eleanor Ostrom's work, pro-social works in that space. Then there's budgeting, like for example, beyond budgeting as a framework to think about budgeting processes. There's of course agile as a way of working in terms of operations, very close to sociocracy. All of them really are very close to sociocracy. They all kind of click into different parts of what is needed in an organization. There is the relationship with the world, like how relationship also with the both the history and the systems around us, ecosystems around us, the moment in time, all of that. So there's permaculture, theory U, commoning, indigenous wisdom in general, decolonization work, the work that reconnects, deep adaptation, all of that. And then there's things that I wouldn't call a framework, but are still touching and again expanding on something that sociocracy is, way too focused on governance for. They're the things like bioregionalism, huge, amazing movement around bioregions, transition. Then there's the Great Simplification, for example, the podcast. Those of you who know it know what I mean, like the different pieces of or bodies of work that and practices that this all connects to. Donut economics. What else are we bringing in here? Mystical traditions, other philosophical things. So much. And that's the place where we would say that's kind of the family that sociocracy lives in. And as a general I think just the way kind of we're interested in these things that has always been on our radar. But I think for sociocracy, there's a particular special thing here, which is that I've never really met a person to whom their first love was sociocracy. Typically, people go and learn programming, they learn, agriculture, they learn whatever. Typically learn at least three or four things before they're like, wait, and how does one do organizations then? If you feel like it, put in the chat what things you learned before you learned about sociocracy. Like not all the things, but like the typical kind of that I would call gateway drug systems here of what are the things that led you to sociocracy. And we see activism, nonprofits, permaculture, and we see municipalist organizing. Interesting. Another way in. Organizing, democracy, advocacy. We have some people plus wanting for other things like permaculture and NVC. There we have a whole list. Fifth discipline, theory U, system dynamics, change management, lean. So that's really interesting to me because again, sociocracy is not a system that you're like 18, you're like, I wonder what kind of governance systems there are, and then you look around and then you find sociocracy, you're like, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. That's just never really what happens. And I think there's a good reason that I'm very curious about, which we can play to later, but I think it is that sociocracy or that governance in general is just a muscle that is not very strong in people in general in the society. We think about kind of having a voice and we think about all kinds of other stuff, but we don't think so much about systems of the sizes of organizations and their health and well-being. Thank you for adding your practices. So that's why we always knew we had to play well with all of those. And Jerry, that's I think where you wanted to bring in kind of what was your path. What would you have written in the chat here?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, like it's, of course, for many of us, the start comes with pain, with living in the world as it is, and the hierarchical systems of education and class positioning, that I grew up with, and dropping out of grad school because it's like, wait, why I can't become a psychologist and try to help each person to adapt to a sick society. We've got to do something about the society, uh, and so that's part of the path that led me to nonviolent social change as a frame, which historically also just the particular formation that I was part of, which includes also Eric, who's on this call, was collectives, making decisions by consent with lots of feedback, working towards egalitarianism, and sort of like Gee, that's I could say that, except changing the word consensus to consent, that describes sociocracy. Um, and part of that is is also the anarchist, the strain for me of like anarchist thinking, as opposed to capitalist or even communist. That for me, anarchism was everyone's involved in governance. And to me, that's what sociocracy is. Everyone's involved in governance within the organization. And that's the vision of wanting to see a society where everyone's involved in governance with all the nested systems that we would need for that, which we're not quite ready for. But and this will come up later, but the nonviolence frame for me also started with Gandhi and civil rights movement and the feminist movements as inspirations. So there was always that sort of spiritual element of we are we're all the same, we're all unique, but we're all the same, we're all united, we're all one world. How do we understand what now we tend to call the story of connection, the story of togetherness, as opposed to the story of separation? Check there.
Yeah, just kind of to for completeness for me, the path was probably the most through NVC. I often think of NVC as the place kind of where I was able to do the restructuring of mindset. And then sociocracy was just kind of a tool thing to learn. But once you're kind of there, once some kind of system kind of brings you into some of the basic relating things and one can shake off a little bit of the old conditioning, then sociocracy is easier to learn. Um, yeah, and that was all through community, right? Both nonviolent communication and then a little bit later sociocracy as well. All through community, which to me all belongs into the same pot in my head. Um,
Changing the world one community at a time, one organization at a time. And
yeah.
Ted, I wanted to also just invite you to say something about linguistics, since that's your background. And I do think that that really heavily influenced you into being able to welcome sociocracy and influence how sociocracy has developed.
It's funny because Jerry knows this, but it's funny to me because so those of you who don't know, my first career was in linguistics, so I spent 10 years on syntax and semantics, which is great fun, but then I left that because I wanted to do something more kind of real in the world. And in particular, I was bothered by academia always teaching you how to shoot things down. Pretty good at that. I'm pretty good at that. If you want me to read something and shoot it down, that I can do. But I don't want to do that. It just feels like such a pointless exercise. So I was more interested in, I guess, in a Gandhian frame, the constructive program of no, I want to build something that works a little better. I don't know, I want to show and do something and not just smart ass my way through the world. But yeah, and then so the way I would have told the story, and that's all needed for context. The way I would have told that story was that linguistics and academia and that competitive world I kind of left behind, and then I turned a corner, moved into community, and learned about all these other things. That's how, for at least maybe 5 or 6 years, I told myself that that was the story. Kind of, I failed on that, closed, dropped out, new thing. And I still remember the moment actually it kind of clicked in my brain where I was like, that's funny, actually, the way you kind of think of like the way the field of syntax that I was trained in thinks about sentences is basically almost the same as the circle structure. You kind of combine words into phrases, phrases go with phrases, there's certain combinations about work, certain ways of connecting them, and so on, and certain ways in which they relate to each other. And like, wait, that's a circle structure. I've been doing the same thing all along of kind of understanding of what are the logical self-contained packages and how do they relate to each other and what are the constraints. It's just the same thing again. I know this is very abstract, and it was still very exciting because also in linguistics there is kind of the general vibe, at least again in the area where I studied. that you would assume that every language has the same value. Like there's not a more valuable language than another. So every natural language comes with the complexity, the adaptivity, the flexibility, and all of that. So it's just as valuable. Just to give you a flavor of what that means, my one of my supervisors, he in the US, there's a test that is used in order to test whether children, like the language ability of children. And the way the test was designed, when kids grew up in a place where Afro-American English was spoken, which is basically like a, it's its own version of a of English grammar, then they would fail on the test. So it was basically a pathologizing of that way of speaking, which is ridiculous because why would it be worth less? It's just different, just like any dialects are similar. So anyway, that is all very similar for me to the approach in organizations of there will be basic ways of relating, but then how you end up plugging together your organization, if it works, that's great. I assume that's great. So there's like a deep egalitarianism in that form of linguistics that I was in. So that certainly carried over as well.
Yeah. We're both academic dropouts.
Hmm?
We're both academic dropouts.
Yeah, that's true. Um, and then, so going back here, the interesting thing about all these systems that I kind of alluded to in the beginning is what do they all have in common? Why, how do we know which one belongs into the group and which one is not in the group? And I want to acknowledge there's a colleague, or two colleagues actually, Lorraine and Pascal. I'm going to put a Medium article that they wrote a while ago, kind of coining the term transformative social system, TSS. It's something that lives in my brain now as well, as something that I use for myself. So that's interesting to read later. Um, but what I guess maybe I want to play the question into the audience first of what are some of the I will show you some of the systems that the article claims as part of the family of frameworks, and then we make a little chatterfall in the chat about what they all have in common. Like this is from the article, like all the different pieces where they say, those are examples of like this um, of transformative social systems. Sociocracy, Montessori, human design, lean, integral, some of the things that we've already talked about come up here again. For some people, the entryway into all of it is somatics, or many people I know take a side, like a detour into somatics, from sociocracy into somatics and back. That's something that happens quite a bit. I find that fascinating. So some of these, and I'm sure there are more. But what do we think they all have in common? And that's a thing for the chat. Group and community oriented, human centered. Yes, those are holistic. Yeah. And by the way, we're not like this is not going to be a right or wrong exercise, right? Because I don't think that there's one word that describes them all. At least not a word we know yet. Maybe there will be one in the future. But it's more like what in linguistics actually we call family resemblance, like, oh, those two share this, and this other features is shared by those two, and they kind of stick together just like a family is together, but not all the same. If you have 5 kids, then not all of them will have the same features, and still you see the resemblance. There we have mirroring life processes, and the fact that we are also life and have core needs shaped by the fact that we're life and animals. Very nice. Systems complexity, relationships, sense making, action taking, decision making, consciousness, awareness. Giving you more time. Life giving. Jerry, what's your answer?
What do they all have in common? Connection. So much, yeah, so much for me just seems to be that basic connection versus separation.
Yeah, that interconnectedness. Um, I would throw in there one thing that I appreciate probably the most right now, at least, is the ability to hold complexity without flattening it too hard, too fast, too soon. Um, if you think about a circle structure in sociocracy, there's all these different pockets of where in the organization people do different things. And because of the local decision making within the circle, you're able to respond to things without kind of flattening it into one narrative. You don't have to give a top-down directive that is one thing because everybody can kind of respond on their own. So there's more complexity in the system that can be addressed than you could in a hierarchical system, for example. And that goes along with what Emily is writing about reckoning that the status quo isn't working and then redesigning towards that. Okay.
I was just thinking about separation again, and 'cause I go swim. There's a pond near where I am, and I go swimming. And entering water is like that's a closer connection than air, and it's a different connection in the world. So I'm aware of my body more. I'm not in the city in buildings. Also, like walking in the woods at night where it's like, ooh, there's a little bit of that, not exactly fear of the dark, but I'm aware that I'm an animal and there's other animals and so it's kind of like bringing me back, both those things, the woods or the water, brings me back into connection, which is easy to separate when I'm living inside of a building that's disconnected from nature. Um, so and that ties back into just the Aboriginal wisdom, the indigenous wisdom that never left, never got separated.
I really like the metaphor of water on here, by the way. And I like the both and of kind of something that is more in contact with you, right? A closer connection without being a brittle connection. It's that metaphor brings a lot of the things that are dear to me in this context. But then, and then on the other hand, what comes with water is that it's different from walking on land. You need to know how to swim, and that's another thing that comes up for me a lot in working with sociocracy and organizations, especially when implementing. It's kind of if you want to do this without hierarchy, then you will have to learn how to swim. And to me, sociocracy then is almost like a protocol by which you can stay afloat as a collective of people. Um, because otherwise yeah, it's hard to stay afloat without a system. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's I guess what I keep going back to. That's another thing, by the way, that I think they all have in common. That maybe not all, but there's something about a belief in um, that I'm a better person or that things work better, and including myself, if there's somewhat like if we agree on a little bit of a system. Like rounds, just like I assume that I'm a better person when we do rounds. So in a way, I'm ceding some of my autonomy, give it to the process because I think that that is a good idea both for the group and for me. So I'm giving up power for the sake of health of the system overall, and the agreement that comes with rounds. So that to me was a big eye opener in sociocracy that definitely has some connection with all the other systems and frameworks as well. And Eric is saying we also need to learn and walk to live on land. That is true. That is true. But I think we've done a fair bit of that because I guess my fear is, how much land is there, especially in a time of change? Um, sure, that is true. And there's also so much false certainty out there. That feels like land, but really you've just been telling yourself that it's all solid and clear. I'm trying not to go to earthquake metaphors, but there's something there about things just even on that level being shakier than, yeah, being shakier these days. Jerry, are you sitting on something right now?
I was just thinking about how much knowledge we, particularly in Western world, have lost. I'm thinking of, because I was talking about water and talking about the woods, and connection. It's like, wait, but what if I meet a grizzly bear? Or what if I meet an alligator? Or what's my connection to ticks and mosquitoes? It's like, oh, all those are other to me and scary in various kinds of ways. But that also means that I've lost the heritage, the long centuries of course we would have known how to talk to bears and alligators because we would have coexisted with them for so long that we know when to give them space, but we've lost that sense of knowledge of how to coexist in a way that allows, sort of the most needs being met by all the living creatures. Um, so that's the place that I just went to.
And that reminds me of something somebody told me once. I think the person came from Ireland, but that's almost besides the point because that person was, I don't know, fair bit older than me and said as they were growing up, if everybody above the age of 16 had all of a sudden died, they would have been able to run everything. They knew how to run the farms, they knew how to run everything around them. At 16, they kind of knew how everything worked. That is not true anymore. Now people go to school for I don't know how many years and they're still useless for the market at that point. It's fascinating to me, this whole thing that we have to learn so much to exist in the world that we're in, and then again, turn electricity off, like completely pathetic. So there's that extreme and especially kind of the knowledge-based things instead of the experience-based things that we have now. Like we know all kinds of stuff, but we can't really do much. Um, so that's interesting to me. And that to me actually has a sociocracy connection that I find interesting. And that is that I find sociocracy sometimes hard to do when you have a lot of expert knowledge that is needed to run the thing. When there's higher differentials between what people know, because then it's hard to have shared reality and talk to like have yeah just have shared reality and a common sense on what you should do about certain things. Um, a very simple example that uh, showed up in SOFA is, for example, with technical expertise or non-technical expertise. If the differential is very, very big, and then people have a hard time even understanding each other's world, then it's hard to make decisions together. And that means that basically in sociocracy, it works the best if everybody is a little bit of a generalist. And I'm sure specialization and expertise is great, but we also need that fluidity of moving people around in roles. There's something needed here. Can somebody, free up a few hours and go there? Like, is there a little bit of moving around? And it doesn't lend itself so well to something where you have to do exactly one role for 40 hours a week because that's what you studied to do for 20 years. It's just there's lack of flexibility is there.
Which to me, I mean, the sort of the urgency of our times means that we all need to learn more about how to get along with each other as human beings. We all need to know, well, not all of us, but many of us need to know how to grow food. We need to know how to just work with simple tools. I mean, all the things that are going to become more needed from my perspective as the system uh, collapses and we need to go back to a simpler living, which I welcome. Uh, and part of that learning, yeah, not only how to get along with people, but how to organize, how to self-organize, and that to me, that's kind of where again sociocracy comes back in. Is to me, sociocracy is the foundation, as the the operating system for all the different things that we need to organize. So it's kind of like some of the common language across all the different disciplines, whether you're trying to work on transportation or farming or building, underneath all of that is going to need to be governance and some way of sorting out how those decisions are going to get made at a very local level, at a more regional level, at a more global level. So, yeah, so that's kind of where I see the future. Whatever happens in this world, whatever collapse does or doesn't happen, that the need to know how to organize and make decisions is going to be basic. And this is also what I feel comforted in a sense by the work of Lynn Ostrom about the Ostrom principles. This was the counter to Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons, where we destroy the commons because we overuse them. Um, and Lynn Ostrom did research that found, well, no, if there are certain frameworks in which commons have been very successful, and she developed and wrote down, sort of like the 8 principles that define what a successful commons would be. And talking to David Bollier recently, he just remarked, that all the problems of the world we have are commons problems. Water, land, air, internet. Uh, they're all related to things that are not being managed in the way we do know how to manage commons. Um, so, Ted,
Can I jump in there? I say more. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Well, and that's I wanna jump in here because I said in the beginning that I think it's no coincidence that governance is that muscle is underused. Because I think that is, I mean, in the most optimistic version of things, I'm thinking that this is what humanity needs to relearn right now. That is like solving coordination problems and having the tools for that, and maybe, more sophisticated tools because of complexity. That's what we need to learn right now. And to me, the status quo is that people actually know even less about this kind of stuff these days than maybe when there was more direct cooperation happening. I'm not sure about that, I guess. But definitely they don't know enough to do what we're trying to do. Um, like when I see what my kids learn in school, for example, I I I I could get really angry about the fact that they learn absolutely nothing about teamwork in school. And I mean nothing. And if they learn anything, then it is counterproductive. Because what happens quite a bit is they're thrown into group work, oh, do this, whatever, presentation as a group, and then with absolutely no help or guidance, it's just complete chaos. Somebody ends up doing it the night before, and then what did they learn? That they hate group work. Same thing with we're voting for our whatever class speaker here. In Germany, that's a thing. And what do? Well, of course, they do a majority vote. What else would they do? Nobody tells them anything else. And of course, they vote the most popular people. What did they just learn? That's how democracy works. Like, and beyond that, they learn nothing. And I just, when I think about it and when I look at the stuff that they do, I'm like just speechless of like, this is just such a blatant gap in what is happening. And I find it completely unacceptable because it means basically what happens, and now I'm going more to a theory of change around sociocracy. What happens is that we basically, as Sociocracy for All, for example, how many times have I thought I shouldn't even be having to do this job? This should have been taught in 10th grade. Like, why are we still dealing with of writing an operational role? Come on, you've learned to write 100 essays in school. Nobody taught you how to make a group decision. I don't know. Like, what? So now imagine we lived in a world where kids actually did come out of school. And of course, many of them live in communities, they're in places, they see group decision making in a way that actually works. We would be in a completely different situation by now. So there's a huge omission there, lost opportunity. And that's not even talking about schooling in general. I just only mean that one piece. Um, and there is one positive vision that I sometimes hold on to, or actually, it's a story that happened. I know that I want to tell the story of intentional communities of the sector because that's how Sociocracy for All looks at the world. We kind of look through a sector lens. And what that means is we look at sociocracy and its use in nonprofits, in the world of permaculture, in whatever. And I remember, when we started, there were like a few crazy communities that were dabbling with sociocracy, but there wasn't really much. And one had to really kind of make the case of, yeah, this is a real thing. People still sometimes think it's a theory and they don't understand that sociocracy is already used. They're like, oh, that sounds like a great theory. Anyway, but that's then, so intentional communities, basically sociocracy, unknown, no credibility back then, and so on. Now, then a few years ago, it must have been during the pandemic. So let's say it was in 2021. A group came to me. I might have told the story here before, but it's just so fascinating to me. The group did not know about sociocracy whatsoever. They didn't know what it was, but they told me that they want to use it and they wanted to hear basically what do we need to do. And I was very confused about it because it's like, wait, typically people learn about it first and then they want to use it. They don't say, I want to use it and then they learn about it. That's reverse. I don't understand. Like, how did you get here? I asked them, like, I don't understand what you're doing. And they said, oh, well, we researched the most common, like, we send a task force on the task of figuring out what are the most common governance systems for intentional communities. And the answer everybody gave us was that sociocracy is the system that we should use. So we're using it. And I thought, well, that's interesting because something has shifted here in that sector. Who did they ask? But they didn't, they really did ask around. So this was kind of the field overall had shifted. And then just, I think a year or two ago, somebody told me that she started a community. First meeting they had, 8 people present. Very first meeting of that forming community, 8 people present. She asked, I would like to run this sociocratically. Does everybody know what this is? Everybody raised their hand. Everybody had attended a training. They made the decision to adopt sociocracy in that first session. If you go to some place and you can expect that people kind of know the basic grammar of how to do things together, that would be so much easier. I was at a parents' evening at my kid's school yesterday. By means of how well the meeting was run, I would say that's a complete fail. It's like, it was so bad. And I was just walking home thinking like, what do we need to do so I don't have to attend meetings like that anymore? Like, what needs to happen so there's the skill building and what kind of world would that be? Check.
And yeah, and what kind of world would that be? Would be one where sociocracy is becoming the part of the ecosystem and not just isolated, right? There was that old statement of you can't have communism or socialism in only one country in a capitalist world. And it feels, you can play with sociocracy, but it's not going. You can do functional sociocracy in an organization here and there, but it's not going to make societal change until they start integrating with each other, until the food co-op and the farming co-op and the educational co-op are all integrated with each other, have connections, and they're all following, as Ted was just saying, this foundational that way of doing decision making and organizing. That you can walk into a completely different sector and go, oh, I may not know the information about this sector, but I see how you're working and I understand that. And that means we can also increase our levels of collaboration. So it's not just isolated organizations, but this ties into the kind of the bioregional, localization perspective of how do we build from the base, from the ground up. And I'm just starting to wonder what's coming up for people as we talk, because you're all doing as much thinking as we are, and I'd be curious to open up reflections and comments. You okay with that, Ted?
Sure.
Anybody move to speak?
Um, Hi everyone. Liz,
Hey, Lizanne.
say Happy Canada Day. I'm here on Canada Day. Thank you. I was just thinking about the gateway into sociocracy and why it made so much sense to me when I first heard about it was because I grew up in under apartheid, which is a system of absolute separation and legalized racism. I had this internal yearning always for the opposite of that, which is relationship and connection. And throughout the years that I was teaching, I would like try and, in my own intuitive way, do the opposite of what was outside the classroom, inside the classroom. And the thing about doing that is that you as teacher are also in relationship, right? So you encourage relationship with the kids, but you are also, and so that kind of like disrupts the hierarchy in the classroom a bit because you have to be responsible to the relationship as well in a kind of connecting way. And here in at Windsong, we're just trying to fully implement sociocracy, and it's kind of when Ted said things are difficult when there's a different level of understanding of a thing. That's really a lot of what's happening, and it feels like this. You have to, at one hand, swim and teach people how to swim at the same time, which is really difficult. That's what that's what's coming up for me right now. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's what sparked with what Jerry said about connection and relationship and what Ted said about like the difference in understanding levels when you're trying to govern together, but there's some people are swimming and other people you got to be teaching other people to swim.
I would love to comment on that. Thank you. Um, Thank you for that, because one of the pieces that clicked in place for me a bunch of years ago was realizing, oh, if I want to have good working relationships with other people, I need to be invested in their learning as well. And I'm not saying I will tell them what to learn. That's not what I mean. But like my interest has to be everybody's skill level going up in general on all the things. Because otherwise, I depend on them just as much, for the whole thing to work. So then all of a sudden, to me, that includes kind of all of that of everybody needs to know. I need to be interested in everybody else's agency as well. I have no benefit from somebody else having low agency and like leading a department, like that we're all depending on. Like everybody depends on everybody else. And it's so trite and obvious, but when you feel it in the organization, like, oh, this is really truly, this gives kind of it gives a flavor to no one is free until all are free. It we depend on each other in this way. Um, and that's I noticed that so I'm right now I work a particular job where I'm interiming in an organization that's technically not sociocratic, which is really interesting as an experience. It's kind of adjacent, but it's not sociocratic. So now what happens there is that I notice that people wait a lot, for somebody to make a decision, for somebody to do this, for that. It's like, wow, where's your agency, people? I'm not even used to that anymore. I'm like, wait, if you are upset about that not being done, why haven't you created a role yet and filled it? I don't understand. Like, what's the holdup? I just don't understand what the holdup is. Yeah, but that level of agency, it's really enjoyable to me. It's really enjoyable to me when it's there, and I'm totally, totally inspired still by making that possible for more people. Emily, are you gonna speak out loud as well? Or are you just putting wisdom in the chat? I don't know if you're in a position to speak. Oh, there you go. I would love to hear it out loud, honestly. If you're willing. I'm sorry I put you on the spot, but I was just so curious about kind of wanting to hear it in words.
Don't have sound, do you?
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
there
We'll
is
wait.
no
We'll wait.
sound right now.
I can go ahead, Ted.
Go. No, no, go, go, go.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm a little bit distracted because I have a kid preparing for a driver's license test, but life interim. But what's coming up for me and a lot is I've been doing more work with permaculture and sociocracy, and and presenting a little bit on how both of them are sort of off ramps and how vital it is for like people who have any kind of sociocracy training. I've been talking to people who want to see more resilience in their communities, who want to see people coming together, that sociocracy trained facilitators can really step into meetings and places and spaces and help hold the container for transformative conversations to happen, no matter the level of training. And so I really have been struck by this idea of us as sort of resilience first responders in different contexts. I think we have a really strong role to play, whether people have geeked out on governance as much as we have or not. And I think there's a place with permaculture as well, but that's what's been capturing my imagination a lot this summer. So I just wanted to offer that out. There's probably more to say, but that's what's coming up.
And Eric.
Yes, what you were just saying, Ted, is I think very interesting. The agency that people have, or actually do, or maybe they're waiting for leaders. When I first found sociocracy, I was very enamored with a lot of its structures and how it worked. And in some of the introductions that I've been doing, and I've been mainly doing introductions, I started mentioning the tools. And I realized, no, that's not what drew me into it. That didn't draw me into it. What drew me in was that it fit my values. And so I've changed the introductions that I have, and I start with values. What values do you have? And are the current systems, your group, your organization, whatever that you see in the world, fulfilling for your values or not? And as I said, I got interested because I realized it was my values. It spoke to my values. So I'm trying to help people discover, well, these are the values I have, and this is what sociocracy could do to fulfill those values. And I've been much more able to reach people instead of just explaining how it works. And it's so easy to, as you mentioned, to just wait for the other person to do it and not really take the initiative because, well, who am I? I'm just one person. I'm not the leader or whatever. There are many reasons, many factors. So I think that's for me a new step at connecting and helping people to connect to their values. And once they do that, then they get more excited about, yeah, we got to try it out in our group. We got to learn how to do it. We got to figure it out because, you know, you look at any of the books, it's a lot of stuff to learn, you know, a lot of things to go through and think about and understand. If you're not excited about it, it makes it some more rote learning and really um, excited learning.
In my experience with people and values is that so often values are an intellectual thing.
Mm.
They're not a lived thing. Even I notice I have all sorts of values that I violate all the time because of living in the world that we live in. And so there's that aspect of sitting in meeting after meeting where each person gets to have a voice and be heard and taken seriously. It's like, oh, now I'm having the lived experience and not just the intellectual experience of every voice matters. So I hope that sociocracy, like many of us come to sociocracy because of the values that we have. And then I also hope some people emerge through sociocracy because of what they experience. What was it? Just a number of times now where I've heard people say, "This is the first time that I've been listened to, that my voice mattered." We just heard that from an organization that we've been working with. You know, complex organization which involves everybody from gardeners to cooks to nursing home to all sorts of different aspects of it. And there are people there who've never been listened to. They just did their jobs, but their voices were inconsequential. And now they're being asked, what do you think about this? How should we go about this? You've got experience. You're the one who's got your hands in the dirt or your hands in the kitchen. You know some things that the people in the office, behind the desk and the computer don't know. Um,
The term that always comes up for me around that is reclaiming governance. And what I hear and what Eric said is basically the like helping people see that this is not something that is done to them, but something that, once you open the door, something that they would want, you know? And then the reclaiming that happens when people kind of wake up to that agency and having the tools and all of that. And Jerry, wait, what was it now? I wrote down the word separation. Oh yeah, there's a separation that I think is subtle, but that sociocracy completely breaks, and it's a separation between those who know and those who do. Because traditional governance is so separated in people's minds between those who know and those who do, those who plan and those who carry out. How many times I've had this discussion with people on the difference between policy and operations, the way I teach it versus how it is held in your typical nonprofit governance, where it is a matter of, those who plan and those who do. While in sociocracy, those who plan and those who do are the same people. You just do it on different topics. We basically switched our logic by 90 degrees. And that's subtle, but I find it completely transformative. So there's another separation that goes out the window, and all of a sudden, up and down doesn't mean much anymore, right? Or left and like it just doesn't mean so much anymore. That's a piece I really love.
I'm going to piggyback on that, just a sense of sort of lateral knowledge sharing, lateral cooperation. Because living in a co-housing community as I do, well, we've got a whole bunch of garden space, but there's very few of us who know much about that. But then, you've got people like Rhonda who knows about permaculture. Like, oh, if Rhonda was a neighbor or if Rhonda lived here, you know, then that whole notion of permaculture would also permeate, our community. Um, so to me, it's that's part of the hopeful vision is that that lateral, the interweaving, the rhizomes will start interconnecting more. As I hear, oh, there's a food forest in Austin, Texas that is practicing sociocracy. Oh, there's also a food forest up in Seattle area that's doing sociocracy. Food forest. I never knew about food forests until a couple of years ago. So, and that's just one tiny slice of the things that are going on in the world. Um, so I'm just looking forward to that day when those threads start meeting each other and the synergy starts really building. Um, I'm envious sometimes of what the work that's being done in Austria, where there are 30 something co-housing communities that are sociocratic. And some of the people who are in political office live in them. So now they're starting to have gatherings of mayors of cities in Austria where they can start talking about sociocracy. They're not implementing it yet, but the conversation has started. So that's kind of the hopeful piece. I'll say another hopeful piece for me that relates to this. Um, there's a possibility of getting a grant to do work in Australia uh, that will tie in Western responders to disasters and the Aboriginal clans that live in the lands where disasters might happen. And historically, there's no connection between the two. The Westerners will come in and say, you need to move, you need to do this because of the cyclone, whatever is happening. Meanwhile, the indigenous knowledge around how to deal with nature's whims does not listen to, or the indigenous knowledge of how the clans relate to each other, relate to the land, how they could respond is not listened to. So how could we teach the Westerners sociocracy so that they start understanding what it means to work as equals? So they can enter into a dialogue with the Aboriginal clan leaders who already know how to work as equals. So that's kind of an inspiring, and then I go, oh, what if this really works and it starts spreading through emergency preparedness? It's another sector that I had never thought about as a place where sociocracy might grow. Because the relationship between those responders and the people on the ground who are being impacted, it's got to be key.
Yeah, all those interconnected dots where then my hope is that there will be kids who've experienced this in school and then they go into a workplace or two with and then eventually they just have the expectation. Like I have one cute little story about my daughter that I thought about recently. She was maybe, I don't know, how old was she? Maybe 9. And we had been kicked out of a thing. That's irrelevant, too long of a story. We'd been kicked out of a thing, so instead of going there, we couldn't go there. So I wake her up and I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, we're not going to the thing today. And she was like, that's odd, isn't that like they can't just unilaterally send us out? Isn't that a decision we would make together? And I was so proud of my 9-year-old, just saying that like the most normal thing of even leaving is negotiated together. Like this is something that this is something that we hold together. And she wasn't even fully awake yet when she said it. It was like, that's really deep in there. I love that. I really, really love that. Um, she would probably deny it now that she's 20, but it is still there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think with the like all the interconnectedness, there's something about orienting, and I do want to highlight that Sociocracy for All is a movement organization because that's important to me. Because what we understand, I think, in Sociocracy for All is that we're not the movement, right? We're not like there's different people doing sociocracy, and that's great, but that we inject kind of things that are helpful to the movement, and that we that and that's important to me because there's an orientation to me that I find how do I say this? Like there's a once you understand that it's not about having power for the sake of having power, but that it's really about what's the social tissue here and what's the status of its health and how can we do something or help something to make a connection somewhere to heal it more. Um, then we're orienting towards something bigger, both in our governance and in our orientation. And that's become even more important to me in the recent years of just not just carrying out your purpose, but actually being a part of the ecosystem that you're in and being like a responsible player in it. That I think is another step that sociocracy is helping me see. I don't know where I would have been without, but I do credit it to sociocracy that I was able to see that and orient towards it. No, that kind of opens the door to what is bigger than us. What is a social fabric between us? What is maybe even bigger than the social fabric? It becomes a spiritual question as well. What is that? What is that bigger thing that we're all a part of and that we can't control, that we can only be in relationship with and kind of bend a little here and there to make things more comfortable and maybe more aligned. But other than that, we're part of a big universe. Yes, exactly,
You know, you,
Jason.
yeah, your story, Ted, about your 9-year-old reminds me of the story of my 9-year-old. uh, when at some point he said to me, "So, we get in trouble if we shout, and if we raise our voices in school. But how come that rule doesn't apply to the teachers? They can do all the shouting they want." And what it strikes me is that context is people are not listening to each other. The students are, the teachers aren't listening to the students aren't necessarily listening to the teachers. It's not a listening environment enough. I know some classrooms are very different, because of the particular teachers, like Lausanne's classroom perhaps was. But to me, that it's maybe the commonality of what we're talking about is about listening. How do we listen to each other? How do we listen to the land? How do we listen to the dynamics, whatever sector, whatever the field is of focus that we're in? Take that to the bigger, how do we listen to the universe? How do we listen to God? How do we listen to beauty? Whatever that means to any of us.
Shall that be the closing words? Unless you have more. No, you have more. Keep going.
We have more, don't we? I was just actually looking at something you had written, Ted. It's in the manure, not in transcendence. Um, you want to say that in your other statement about managing complexity does not mean cheating death?
Oh, well, yeah. Okay, let me unpack that just a tiny little bit. And I know people are dropping off, but so there's another separation that was pointed out to me in the work by John Viveki, actually, but it fits right in here. Um, and it's the idea that there's a separation between thinking and doing, that we have a brain and our brain thinks and our body carries out what our brain says. From a cognitive science perspective, that's complete bogus. That is not true. In the same way, I so resist any kind of, we make a strategic plan and then we carry it out. It's like, no, that's probably just as much bogus. And we can see that in how many strategic planning processes fail, by the way. Like, look at the statistics, it's mind-boggling. It's about as effective as like medieval treatment for the plague or something. It's like, it's really bad. Like, it's really bad. And just because it fits our current worldview doesn't make it any more effective. Okay. That aside, I think we will look back at strategic planning processes and laugh in a bunch of decades. But so there's that separation between thinking and doing, and then also the idea that there's kind of unity in the abstract. People often go into the abstract. And that's not a bad thing. Like, for example, in nonviolent communication, if you think about it, you kind of go to needs, and needs are universal and everybody shares them. You kind of go to a high level of abstraction, like belonging, for example, is a need. That's a high level of abstraction. It's very far away from what just happened. Okay. Um, and I think, I mean, while I still appreciate that, I'm less interested in kind of that separation between, oh, there's kind of the goodness is kind of up here. That's where God is. That's where, all the goodness of the world is. Just somehow that story has lost its draw for me. I just find it not interesting enough, honestly. What I'm more interested in is now going kind of the other way. And I know I'm not alone with that because, for example, people talk about embodiment instead of transcendence. Transcendence is kind of float away from your everything, while embodiment is no, actually go deeper in. Like, what is this? What is this incarnation thing? Like, there must be a reason we incarnated. And I don't mean, like me personally, but kind of being in a body has its own draw. There's stuff you can do in a body that you can't do without. And I think there's experiences to be had. And that's, I think sometimes that's not appreciated enough. And to me, for example, if we go to policy making, in policy making, one notices it. Sometimes people are really upset when policies are not followed. I'm like, well, what's more real, the policy that you wrote or the things that people do? It's obviously to me that it's the things that people do that are more real. So then we have to ask ourselves, did we listen enough instead of walking around and saying that other people are somehow not following and they're being stupid and ignorant? Like it switches the logic around, and basically policy is like in interaction with the world. It's not a top-down process. It's a lateral agreement on how we can make our life easier, how can we set it up so that we all have more clarity in how we do it. Again, in partnership with the doing, not in a hierarchical relationship. So that to me really, really clicked hard. And interestingly, by the way, and you can listen to that a little bit more if you want to hear more about that piece, because I recorded it, put it in the chat. There's a piece there about sociocracy can actually live in both worlds. One can act sociocratically to an extent in a mechanistic, top-down-ish way. And by that, I don't even mean hierarchical, but I mean thinking that policy is made so that people follow it. Like with this, I mean, of course it is made in that way, but it's like, what do I mean? Hold on, let me say this better. That we can boss people around via policies. That to me is basically just a control paradigm pushed into self-management. You can use self-management in a control paradigm nonetheless. While you can use sociocracy in a way where you say, hey, what's happening in the field and what kind of agreement could we make with each other to connect the dots where they want to be connected? We're still doing the same thing, but we're doing it with a completely different attitude. So sociocracy for me is such a cool tool because it can live in that world, and people through the practice might be able to appreciate more and more actually doing it in this less controlly way. More the swimming and less the pretending that we're on land, basically, to go back to that image. That is kind of my piece. And another piece about that is that often people get hung up on the abstract and the values and the needs and the beautiful vision and all the fancy stuff up here, okay? Because that's where perfection lives. Because, for example, belonging is the best thing there is. It's perfect. But no situation ever will catch up to that. You will never meet that in real life. Maybe for a blissful moment, for a hot moment, for a hot minute. But other than that, it's impossible. So what I'm tuned in with my kind of being more in the minutia and more kind of an embodiment is in trade-off relationships. That's kind of my thing these days, of just always thinking about it in trade-offs. Because while abstract things, they don't need to think about trade-offs, but my body needs to think about trade-offs because I'm either here or I'm over there with my kids. I'm either sleeping or I'm, not. Like there's only so many things you can do at a time. And I've first saw that as a nuisance, and now I see it as actually one of the perks of everything. It's actually, I think, where grace is. And then you're basically, I know Jerry will say now, you're going back to chop wood, carry water. But that is really, I think, that is really where it's at for me. That is the most appealing thing. Check.
I just thought maybe you would add into that because another frame you've used before is working with constraints, and that is rather than a burden, it's a freeing. Um,
Yeah. And that's where the cheating death came from that Jerry quoted me on earlier, because I find that when people talk about values a lot, I get nervous because it always seems to me like there's some cheating trade-offs here. It's like I will tell you the most extreme story, and this is a true story. I had somebody tell me, like we were kind of saying, oh, we do have to define priorities because we can't do all at once. And the person said, no, no, actually I can. I don't have to prioritize because I just linearize those things. So he was basically, and I had the same facial expression as you just now, Grace, of like, huh? Like, so I'm like, okay, so you don't have to prioritize because you'll just do one after the other. But that still means eventually you'll die and you won't get to the end of your list. You know that, right? And it's like, that seems odd, you know? But it was for me the most blatant example of you realize God exists and you're mortal, right? I mean, can we just acknowledge that as a starting point instead of somehow pretending that doesn't happen? Yeah, and then here Bernadette is throwing gems into the chat as well. Limitations and constraints offer us choice, and to create we must choose. We can't do it all. And that is, I think, what sometimes we forget. And like, for example, I think about that a lot. You know, if you look at a tree, or if you look at a circle structure, sometimes people are like, oh, it's not fair that this and that person doesn't get to have a voice on this and that. Like, okay, but if we look at a tree, we never ask ourselves these questions. Like, is it fair that the leaf is over there on that tree? That's such a ridiculous question to ask. And in our organization, somehow we get so hung up on this kind of stuff. And I wonder what is driving that, because we seem to be somehow in weird metaphors in our head. I have said my pieces, Jerry. You can say whatever is on your mind, and then we shall close.
I think the other thing that's sort of just I'm sitting with right now, just sort of the word constraints is bringing it up for me. Um, again, that like, well, yeah, I want to belong in the natural world, and yet the grizzly bear in front of me is a constraint for me. It's like, no, I should not keep walking forwards right now. Um, so there's some acceptance of that and relationship to that. Um, and some of those constraints might be I'm not strong enough to win a fight with a grizzly bear. I'm not fast enough to outrun, the whatever it is, the cheetah. I do get triggered by that particular person and how they talk to me. And that's my constraint, is how effective I am at dealing with my internal reactions to the world that I live in, and how to in some places accept the constraints that are present, in some cases looking at what are the constraints that I'm creating that are not real, they're not necessary. So what are the where are the constraints more able to be loosened, and whether they just need to be accepted as they are. The contradiction of, when you say love the world as it is, um, that still opens us to do work to change the world as it is. They're not in contradiction with each other. Um, I'm complete.
Well, thank you all for hanging in there. I'm gonna formally close this, but I think at least I will stay on for a moment. But thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. Um, I'm feeling some sense of completion, and that's good. You're welcome to leave a comment in the chat, and we'll see what happens next.